Hi, everyone. Welcome to the National Conference of State Legislatures virtual meeting series. I am so pleased to have with us an expert on students with disabilities in the education system today. This webinar, or this virtual meeting, is called Ensuring All Students Have Access to Education When Schools Are Shut Down, and it is particularly focused on serving students with disabilities. As a reminder, we ask that you follow the following protocol for today's virtual meeting. Please join us by video rather than phone, and please be sure to add your full name to your tile so that we can easily see who is joining us today. And you can change your name on your tile by clicking on the three dots in the upper right-hand corner and typing your first and last name for us. That would be really helpful. Also, please mute your audio unless you are speaking, and you can also virtually raise your hand if you want to be recognized by the moderator today. And we also are going to ask you to type your questions into the chat box, and be sure to not only type questions but also share information on what you're seeing in your state, perhaps links to the guidance that you have for serving students with disabilities that might have been issued by your state education agency or any of your local school districts. That would be great information to share. Please do not share your screen, however, under any circumstances. We want to make sure that we keep this a secure opportunity for everyone. And just a reminder that this meeting is being recorded and it will be archived, and the slides will also be available as well, along with any other materials that we think might be helpful. Today we have joining us Ace Parsi, who's Director of Innovation at the National Center for Learning Disabilities, and he works there to ensure students with disabilities have the full benefits from initiatives aiming to personalize learning for all students. Prior to joining the organization, Ace served as the Deeper Learning Project Director at the National Association of State Boards of Education, where he worked with state boards nationally on a variety of topics, mostly all related to ensuring that students have the knowledge, skills, and dispositions essential for college, career, and civic success. Prior to joining NASB, Ace also held a number of policy research and school-based positions at the Alliance for Excellent Education and a number of other organizations. Of interest, I believe, is that Ace and his family immigrated to the US when he was 8. So his own experience as an English learner and free and reduced price lunch student led him toward his passion to utilize education as a driver for great equity. So please help me welcome Ace today.
Hey, Michelle, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear
Perfect.
you, and I'm going to start sharing my screen so you can share yours.
Great. I just want to ask for apologies and grace at the very outset. I think maybe my daughter is watching something on Netflix, which creates bandwidth issues, as for all of you who work from home might be able to empathize with. And so if I lose you, I'll join right back in. But for now, I'll just share my screen. And great. Yeah, I want to just first thank you guys for having this webinar. I always really enjoy working with Michelle and her team, and they're just first-class partners and first-class centers on anything education related. And the fact that they prioritize this and you all prioritize this highlights just a sense of values, that this is something that we want, equity and inclusion, or not something that we're gonna forget about, not even right now. And you all joining this webinar, I think, highlights your own values of that. And your community's values. So I want to just appreciate that. I think that I just want to start off, this is me, I guess this is my post-COVID haircut. The COVID isolation has brought about great stress, and so I used to have a lot more hair before COVID started. But I want to just start my own background on this. My bio reflects, I'm an English learner. and I was, grew up a free and reduced price lunch student. So I think that when I was working at the State Boards Association, and this is just calling out my own imperfections, I always brought issues of English learners and low income students to the fore with our board members, because that was kind of my experience. There was never a time that a State Board of Education member ever asked me about issues related to disabilities and all the different innovation efforts that we're going, nor did I ever volunteer that. And I want to mention that because I think a lot of our colleagues, policymakers, and practitioners alike, it's not they have ill will towards individuals with disabilities. It's often that they are just kind of like not thought of at the fore of conversation. So one of my hopes for this presentation is to talk about it in a sense of why it's so important to consider the needs of these groups at the very outset. And I'll just start by just talking about, like life and history before COVID are really, really important here, right? Like there was a time in this nation's history where individuals with disabilities, their very right to exist in our society, were put in question. The picture on that left is Francis Galton. He's recognized as the father of modern American statistics. He was also the most avid advocate for eugenics. And if you Google Teddy Roosevelt and disability, you will find things about our nation's history that will horrify you. Again, like in that context, that was a real thing that was part of our history. Following World War II, a lot of people coming back from the war, they missing limbs, other sorts of issues. And so our nation went more from a full exclusion lens to a rehabilitation lens. We were trying to create systems to help individuals with disabilities succeed despite their disability. And only in the late half of the 20th century did we get to that point of some of these major civil rights laws, which are now the bedrock of how we think and treat individuals with disabilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And those were really like things that individuals with disabilities and their advocates fought for, to have a place at the table within our society, and to think about, like, with all the different areas of social progress that we've had over the last 50, 60 years, the disability angle is one of those huge accomplishments that we've had. We have curbsides where people with wheelchairs can have access to public accommodations and access buildings. And so some of that now is like baked into how we live our lives and educate our children. And it's important in this context that these are not things that we want to take a step back on as a society in light of what's happening right now. And one of the major reasons is that there are enormous implications for when we fail in some of those responsibilities. So these are learning and attention issues. I work for an organization that focuses on learning and attention issues like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, ADHD, and executive functioning issues, but basically just processing issues in the brain that impede students being able to read, write, and engage in math. But this relates to all disabilities, some of these statistics. So our young people with disability learning and attention issues are 3 times as likely as their peers to drop out of high school. They're 41% as likely to complete college. They're twice as likely to be jobless, and they're half as more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. All these are expenses in our society. They're obviously economic expenses, but they're a real moral expense at the end of the day that we have to deal with. And the kids that we are educating, even in light of COVID, will be reflected in these sort of statistics 20 years from now. So we just need to be mindful of that as we pursue. So what does this all mean in light of COVID? As we've moved into into isolation, we've had to rely a lot more on technology. And technology has tangible, not even arguable benefits for our kids with disabilities. We can use technological tools to help pinpoint and identify student needs when it comes to their disabilities. You can use assistive technology to create greater accessibility for students and reduce that stigma by decreasing learning barriers. You can improve engagement of students and be able to track data in a way that can help hold different stakeholders accountable for outcomes. And through that process, you can have greater efficiency of expenses. On the flip side, every single one of those opportunities that I mentioned can be exactly the opposite. When you have a disability, you have some social cues and physical manifestations that technology can't pick up. And so it misses things in terms of identifying young people with disabilities. If the technology is not built in with universal design features in mind, or it's used only for a certain set of students, it can actually decrease accessibility to learning experiences, and it can increase the stigma that certain students have because they are the only ones using technology in a certain way. We know from data, and this is particularly important right now since we're relying so much on virtual schools, that a lot of these virtual schools have terrible outcomes. You know, they like more than half the kids not graduating, achievement outcomes, and those things, issues that many of us were wrestling in our states before COVID are still very much present, holding vendors and others accountable for outcomes. And then if we're not using technology wisely, that it can actually add inefficiency. So the reality is both of these things are possible. And the difference between this is like the explicit decisions we make to actually open doors and create more opportunities rather than closing doors and opportunities for our learners. The next thing I want to just talk about with that tech is that it's not one thing, it's many different functions. And I'll talk about this in the context of just the disability perspective. If you can imagine walking into a room that we'll call, like, metaphorically learning, technology can be used as an assistive technology that can actually provide you access. So kind of opens that door for a student to be able to access learning where they would not have been able to prior. Technology, beyond that, providing accessibility, so once you're in that room, can actually enhance your experiences. So these are things like Google Docs. There are things like video cameras and different software, editing software and things like that. They can be very useful for engaging students with disabilities, but only if they build the accessibility features, have it built in. Then you're in that room. There's a whole other way of technology that's becoming so much more prevalent, especially now in light of COVID, where you break the walls of that room. That learning is no longer confined to that space. And those are learning environments, virtual learning environments, things like that. And those have some very challenging implications for kids with disabilities that we need to be very explicit about and need to make sure that kids are included. So, for example, are the systems, the learning management systems themselves accessible? How do we have when asynchronous instruction is when the teaching is happening at different times. The students are viewing things at different times. And so there might be issues in terms of real-time chat features. Can a student with a reading disability process that? There could be executive functioning issues in terms of being able to, for students to organize information. And so all those things need to be addressed to make sure that students with disabilities are fully having their needs met in this environment. So we have a document, and I'll send this to Michelle, that highlights some of the key terminology related to education technology and how those implications are for students with disabilities in light of COVID. So it includes things like asynchronous instruction. It also includes things like online learning. What could accessibility be and accommodations? Just to give you an example of that, if I have ADHD and I have that that identified in my individualized education plan, in a physical classroom, I may be sitting closer to the front. It's an accommodation called preferential seating. In a virtual environment, that same ADHD issue could provide me all sorts of issues in terms of like the amount of inputs that are coming at me at all times. So it's the same issue, but now in light of what's happening out, we'll need a different set of accommodations. And you need to have the processes and the tools and the supports for educators to be able to deliver on that. Now, I talked a little bit earlier about some of these laws that really were addressing and still do to this day address very fundamental real needs that students have. So ADA and the Rehabilitation Act, really important civil rights laws that give individuals and students with disabilities, so the staff as well as the students, access to the public accommodation of education. ESSA, of course, with the subgroup accountability measures, make sure that we're holding our education system, our policymakers and our educators and ourselves accountable to educating all students. IDEA provides that opportunity for a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. All those laws are still very relevant. I know that we just yesterday, the secretary came out with some guidance that notes that those specific protections within IDEA can't just be waved away. So those are recognizing that we can do this, we can protect individual civil rights, even as we do implementation. There might need to be, in terms of timing, some issues related to that. Of course, like we've had to turn things on a dime, and there could be some things in terms of timing and future compensatory services, but really important to make sure that we take a deep breath and note that this is who we are as a country. We don't take a step back on the important civil rights, and we don't say that just because we're in crisis, that this large group of individuals loses the rights that they have to participate in our society. So considerations for disability, especially right now. One area is that students with disabilities, just like their peers, rely on education as a public good. And they rely deeply on it. I mean, in a way that I was born in Iran, in a way that I am very first-hand familiar with, that other countries don't have the protections and the experiences that we have here in the United States. So students with disabilities rely on education as a public good. That public good has had a real shot to the gut over the course of the last few weeks. And so as we think about state investments and federal investments, we really want to prioritize shoring up that public good. So we know that a lot of our students right now are going hungry. They need those basic needs met. We know a lot of them don't have access to the internet. So broadband, we need to make sure that they have that fundamental access. So there are a lot of different proposals that are going on in terms of like the money that's coming from the federal government, through the CARES Act, and now to new stimulus about what we want to spend in education. And we want to be, as a civil rights organization, and ask you all to be partners with us in this, that we really need right now investments in kids and investments in public education as a public good. We can talk about those hot button issues in terms of vouchers and school choice and things like that after that point. But right now, unity around public education and making sure that public education is strong in each of your states. The second area is that there's an interplay here when we think about technology between anonymity, personalization, and accountability. Technology does provide that level of anonymity for learners and teachers, and we need to make sure that, especially for those learners that have the greatest need, that we personalize and are checking in with them, and that we're holding ourselves as schools and educators and the vendors that are going to be at play here accountable for success of all students. Third, that it's not enough to just say technology for technology's sake. We need to think about what are the tools at our disposal and who are they effective for under what circumstances. And we need to be able to monitor. I mean, that this gets back at the same issue of data and anonymity and those issues. We need to be able to track that so that we know at the end of the day, if there are longer term implications and longer term lessons, who this time served, and how do we support those students who fell further behind. Fourth is the issue of accessibility, rigor, and capacity. And this gets at, there's two ways to think about accessibility. One is, does a student with a disability have physical access to the learning management system and the delivery of learning? The second area, though, that often gets overlooked is that pedagogical accessibility. So the teacher uses the tool, uses the learning management system to deliver content and deliver learning. And so that pedagogical accessibility relates to, can the tool, beyond providing physical access, enable the teachers to deliver content for the benefit of all learners? And so that gets at features like real-time chats and how students can access content and how students can note when they're having challenges. And then lastly on here, considerations for disabilities is that we weren't expecting COVID-19. We weren't expecting to put this much on the ed tech as a key way to deliver learning. And so even before that, I think there were policy advocates that were saying that, you know, right now, the rate of innovation isn't keeping up with the policy safeguards. And so we need to make sure that, like, even as this expands, that we are safeguarding student rights. So the recommendations, I think, one is leveraging resources that you're getting from the federal government and your own resources to address the immediate needs. I mean, I was just talking to Michelle before we started. I am so fortunate that I have a 4-year-old who has food right now and who has kind of, you know, just issues that she has 2 parents that are working from home. There are real immediate needs right now that need to get addressed. For a lot of families, that house is on fire. And I mentioned that for kids with disabilities because those who are traditionally find themselves marginalized will have a more challenging time and are more prone to experiencing trauma at in this context. So leveraging resources to address those immediate needs is really fundamentally important. I hear a lot, for those of you who are psychology or education dorks, that, you know, you can't get to Bloom's taxonomy, those higher level learning needs, unless you start with Maslow's and address those basic foundational needs that students have. Second recommendation is the data and student outcomes. We cannot use this just as an excuse to water down the accountability system or to track students into different qualities of experiences. This may be this may be uncharted time for us, but this is, you know, our students' lives, and these are the future of our community. So making sure that we're being transparent about what's happening with tax dollars and then holding people accountable to outcomes. Third is just making sure that in terms of adults will have incredible needs. I don't know how educators do it when they have to, you know, support their own kids and the learning experiences. But there's real tangible needs in terms of implementing technology, whether it's an IEP meeting or a certain type of pedagogy for non-traditional learners, and doing that well. And then making sure that accessibility is built in at the very outset of any initiatives. I think the main thing that I have this in every one of my slides, even before COVID, is that often what we end up doing is we do what I did when I was supporting state boards of education when it came to kids with disabilities. And that is, you think of a strategy, it's generic and it's general, and you implement that strategy. You laminate that strategy as part of a strategic plan. And then you look at the outcomes 3, 4, 5 months, maybe a year down the line, and you're like, oh my God, why isn't this working for this population? And then you go back to the drawing board and you figure out how to retrofit that population into the strategy. And our approach that we would really urge you towards is that rather than starting from this theoretical center, which, you know, if you guys have people in your districts or in your states that, you know, are this average learner, please take a picture of them and post it on Instagram. I don't know who that average learner is, but I don't know if that person exists. But what we suggest is start at the margins. Start thinking about any initiative that you have by thinking about those students who have the most traditional challenges to the learning environments. And when you create a system that meets their needs, it will meet the needs of all the other learners as well. So avoid that retrofitting. One other resource that I want to share with you all that we've been working on for the last few weeks, and this reflects actually the fastest partnership experience I've ever had in my career. Usually it takes about 6-7 months to come up with these sorts of websites, but we as a disability rights organization and some of our peers were getting messages like left and right, like one thing like, you know, scapegoating kids with disabilities for challenges that were being had, and others just like vulnerably like not knowing how to implement some of these strategies for kids with disabilities. So we brought up, and rather than like having educators go to individual organizations or resort to Googling, we wanted to curate one resource where educators can go and find things that are curated and evidence-based in terms of serving kids with disabilities in the current context. So this is Educating All Learners, EALA, and you can find a resource at educatingalllearners.org. And yeah, we just launched this, and then over the course of like a week, it felt like, I've been joking that it felt like this Avengers movie where we shined the light up into the sky, and suddenly like all these equity organizations came and joined and providing resources. So I really urge you to promote this with your educators in your districts and states. It is a resource that a lot of like people are collaborating and building into. It includes resources, it includes office hours and webinars for educators, and something tools and around ed tech tools. And that's really all I had. I'm sorry, Michelle, because I had my full screen, so I wasn't even checking the time. I'm probably gone way over what you were hoping for, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Unmute myself here. No, you're great. Your timing is perfect. So as a reminder, please type your questions in the chat box, and we will get to those. And I also wanted to do something a little bit different this time. We have a few polling questions that we would like you to address. The first one is, how well do you think your schools are doing serving students with disabilities while schools are closed? And the second question is, are you familiar with your state's guidance to districts on serving this population while schools are closed? So we're going to give you a few seconds to answer the polling questions, and also type your questions into the chat box. Thank you. This is really helpful information, both for us and also for ACE. And assuming that we will not be too surprised by these polling outcomes, it looks like about 50% so are saying that you feel like, or more, are saying that you feel like you're probably doing an inadequate job in your schools serving students with disabilities right now. About a third is saying probably a fair job. And then the second poll is a little bit more mixed. It looks like about 35 to 40% of you are somewhat familiar with your guidance. About 25% are aware, but you don't know the details. And then about 25 to 30% saying that you're not sure whether there is guidance. Thank you. We're going to go ahead and keep that poll open. Okay, we have our first question. This comes from Lynn Murphy. For state legislatures who are not meeting right now, a lot of these considerations for students with disabilities are happening at the local level. What can states do now, if anything, to protect these students? And what should state legislatures be thinking about now to be prepared to address this issue next session?
Great. Yeah, no, that's a great question, Lynn. I think the one area that I would never want to discount in terms of any elected official is the issue of moral leadership, to start off with, that people listen to what you say, and it's important that you reflect in your statements and in what you share that that this is a priority for your community, and to appreciate the educators and the sacrifices that they're making as they're trying to educate all students, lift them up, highlight them in your newsletters and things. So I think that we all often go straight to the tangible policy solutions and we forget that, but I think that that's really important. I think a lot of people are struggling, and it would be great to like highlight this as a value. The second area I think is to just empowerment. While you're elevating that, it's also to share resources like Educating All Learners, because given just putting yourself in the shoes of educators in your state and in your district, a lot of them are, having to take care of their own kids at the same time that they're trying to deliver high quality learning. They're struggling. So to the extent that you can share that resource, that's great. The third thing is, I think, to really advocate both in terms of whatever legislative session, action, or statements, or what have you, that your state education agency, and just as an advocate, that you support public education right now. again, like there's a deep needs that your young people in your state are experiencing right now, much deeper than just like connectivity. You know, issues of needing school psychologists and needing case managers and supporting teachers. Like right now, it needs to be a real all hands on deck, getting food to people. So I don't think, you know, like I think that there's going to be funds that are coming from the federal government, and to prioritize how those funds get deployed. And that's to strengthen, to address immediate needs and strengthen the very foundation of public education, which I think is in many ways just like the foundation of our country and our states. So to make sure that that's not weakened over time. And so any resources that are coming in right now, we may all disagree in terms of philosophically, public schools, and the, you know, so I totally get that we're people of good minds and hearts are on different parts of this voucher issues, but just to make sure that we protect those rights and we provide a really shore up public education right now. So anything in terms of statements or legislative action that can do that would be great.
I would also add, in conversations that I've had with the Council of Chief State School Officers, you know, the School Boards Association and the National Governors Association, that one of the biggest roles that they feel like legislators can be playing right now is meeting with your constituents and meeting with your local school boards or your local principals in your own community, so that you can bring that information back to the state agencies, back to the governor, back to your state board of education, because you know, they only know what they know from their own position, but you are much closer to constituents.
Absolutely.
And so I would encourage all of you to take this opportunity to really be reaching out, finding out how they are thinking about educating students with disabilities, what has been their approach. And in that vein, Ace, I'm curious, are you hearing, do you have any sense of how the teachers and school leaders are thinking about visiting IEPs, meeting with families, checking in on students with disabilities? Do you have a sense of how this is going? Or
I think that there are, so there's, it comes down to a real issue of capacity. And I'm sure, you know, you all are hearing stories within your districts of that are very differ widely. In the sense that there were some schools that had a more robust technological infrastructure and had norms prior to COVID, and those schools are probably, you know, still not doing great, but they're doing better. And there are those that had no preparation for this, and they're struggling to create norms right now in the process. So one of the challenges I think that for families of students with disabilities, especially right now, is that there's so much like rumors going on around them about their kids and whether their kids will get served and, you know, what services they will get and all that, that they end up going to like 5 different people. They'll go to the special educator, they'll go to their general educator, they'll send an email to the principal and the case manager. And so I think to the extent that what we see as a best practice is having immediate like norms and protocols about what you do, who do you go to for a certain need, and go for it to somebody else for a different need, and that those people are finding ways to connect. There are good examples that we've seen of IEPs happening virtually to provide that as a process, and I think that that's for the reason I mentioned before, like really important right now, because some of the accommodations that young people with disabilities need will be different in a virtual context than in an in-person context.
thank you. And that actually leads me to a second question that someone had posed to me a few weeks ago. How are schools assisting parents whose students have physical disabilities and who are relying on that care, that assistance during the day? In this case, it was a parent whose student needed a feeding tube, and the parent had relied a lot on the school to assist with that. Do you have any sense of that? I know you focus on learning disabilities, but
I don't, but it's a question that has an answer, and I can get that to you. I think that one of the things that we've been trying to curate recently is to make sure that we're identifying all sorts of different disabilities. So the Educating All Learners now has groups that represent Down syndrome, for example, and autism, uh, and other sorts of disabilities. So we're trying to get like some of those best practices, and I think it's something that I want to check with our content team on to see if there's anything that's come up. And I know we're also on that website drafting case studies, and that's one of the things that we've been looking for is how are they doing that.
Yeah, we definitely will put up that website along with our resources, because I think it will be tremendously helpful for answering any future questions that legislators or staff may have, and be able to draw on all the resources. Kudos to all of you for being able to pull that together so quickly. It's pretty impressive. Okay, we have one more question. What are best practices for students with disabilities with very high needs, such as students who normally have a full-time aide assigned to them, who may know the student well, but now cannot see the student in person?
Yeah, I think that one of those areas that you're highlighting as a solution within the question that I think is really important is that their students will have full-time aides who know them really well. And so like this is creating a disruption, and within that disruption, whether it's a very high needs student with a disability with a very high needs or lower needs, so high incidence disabilities, I would say that to try to make sure that those connections that they had prior to COVID school closures get maintained. So those relationships. So if you have a Zoom call, to make sure that those individuals are brought in because they know those students well. And so as schools are setting up those processes to make sure that as much potential contact is maintained between those educators and staff that child knows as possible. So I think that that's the biggest thing. And I would say that for every single disability, there's a whole, this also applies to my colleagues who work with English learners, and colleagues who work with, students who are in the foster system and things. We know that within those are categories that we talk about in education, but they are not monoliths. They reflect the continuum of different needs and experiences. And so the question, I think, for schools are, how do we create a plan to identify the students that were experiencing the greatest challenges prior to COVID in our traditional school systems? And what are the challenges that now will manifest in light of COVID and distance learning that will happen? And that's not a one-time conversation. It would be something of a process to set up, to check in with your teams. And that gets at to the issue of what I mentioned earlier, why it's so important to track that data right now and not lose that, because there's a whole new context, and we're going to be, for some states, this will take all of next school year as well. So it's not something that it's going to be you're collecting data and setting up norms for just something that's going to pass in 2 weeks. This could be a long-term reality. So invest that time to identify processes and norms within the school that capture what those students are experiencing, what accommodations, what are the main barriers. Like if you're imagining the student here and jumping to this area, which is learning, what is that gap for that student? And how do you as a school and district marshal those resources? And to Michelle's point, to be able to share those examples with your SEAs. Because the other thing is, like, as you all are experiencing with your state legislature, they're not meeting as regularly. This has thrown their protocols upside down. And so the norms and the mechanisms that they had to get information in the past are not going to be there, and they're going to rely a lot more on you to be able to share that information.
We have another question. This is from Representative Santos in Washington. Do you think that the COVID crisis is revealing issues or gaps in the professional development of basic teacher preparation?
Hell yes. I absolutely it is. I think that it's doing things that from what I'm hearing and talking to my peers in other organizations, that we wouldn't have expected. And so, like for example, take poverty, right? Like if you are a very low income student, you would have previously, in some ways, been able to hide your poverty when you came to school. We had some mechanisms and things. But now the disruption in the home environment, lack of food, lack of connectivity, become much more salient, and they're just not avoidable now. And so I think they call on, like, they show us what are the depth of our challenges are and the depth of our responsibilities in meeting those challenges. For a lot of educators, I think they are seeing their children's homes, their home lives in a new lens, in a way that they wouldn't have had access. So they are getting a better sense of what those challenges for their students are. But there wasn't ever in our teacher preparation programs, there was no rule book on how to do this. There was no rule book on how to respond in light of a long-term crisis like this. So there's a lot of experimentation that are happening, but to be able to capture what those needs are, what teachers are experiencing, having some resource in your state where teachers can kind of like be inputting that, downloading like what some of those challenges are, rather than like doing big like investments in things that may not be working or may not be getting the greatest bang for the buck. We need to be really intentional about leveraging resources to that. So capturing the information is a really important thing. And then I do definitely agree with Representative Santos about the issues of revealing those bigger issues and gaps and how we address them.
I have an additional question. This is a question that's came up quite a bit, and Austin, feel free to jump in here as well to answer this. We've got some concerns from state policymakers and legislators about the responsibility that school districts have to be educating those students right now, and will there be some sort of waiver of that, or understanding of the current situation, some sort of release from that responsibility. What is your sense of this? And I guess at the end of the day, are we opening ourselves up for some sort of action from parents or students?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think that so the secretary came out with her statement, and still Congress will have to decide, but she did not waive IDEA rights of students. And I think that we think that that's really important because of what I mentioned earlier, that this is all happening within a broader historical lens, that when challenging times come, we kind of like, forget or push further to the margins those who are already at the margins, and we push them completely off the table at that point. So I think that the key thing to focus on is timelines. There are things that educators there were IEPs and there were goals and things like that, and a lot of those things are moot right now. We have to like rethink them, how to do that. That doesn't mean that the service can't happen. It means that the timing of that service will have to change those windows, and then how we deliver those accommodations will change. I think that the main issue with that is to be as clear as possible with families of individuals with disabilities that there's a plan in place. It may not, like, that plan may not get implemented next week, but that there's a plan in place and that there's a commitment to providing those compensatory services where the services cannot be delivered immediately.
That's good advice. Austin, do you want to add anything about what's coming down from the Department of Education and from Secretary DeVos?
Yeah, I think what Ace just said is actually a good summary of what the department is saying about how to serve students with disabilities this time. Like you said, there was not any waivers of IDEA requirements, and we're not really expecting any particular guidance to come from the department, which I think is frustrating for some states and districts who are afraid that whatever compensatory services they may offer in these circumstances may in some way expose them to liabilities or lawsuits. And I don't think the department is going to provide any further guidance, at least not for the foreseeable months. So I think we'll end this academic school year without seeing any real guidance. And so I think people rightly have questions about how to serve students during this time. And I think, as they said, the best advice that I've been hearing is to make sure that you have a plan, you're communicating that plan. And I think at this point, that's the best that you can do in terms of the eyes of at least the Department of Education.
Yeah, there was some initial guidance that was reassuring, like when this was weeks ago, but yeah, there hasn't been anything new. And I think that it still lays there a lot of those, just as us saying, like those questions that are still there and lingering and being left to states and localities to wrestle with.
I should be, yeah. And as Bradley points out, there was guidance in the form of some letters in March that said you should continue to serve students even if you move to a distance model, or that moving to a distance model is no excuse for not educating students, which was good. I think where people have wanted more clear answers to their questions about how to do this. And I think in terms of how to serve, we're not going to see a lot of specific guidance from the department. It's just, I think where I think the questions still lie.
Not a how-to guide.
Enough of those out there, right? Feels like an IKEA set right now.
No clear instructions, direction. Can either of you answer this question? Is there a dedicated funding stream or flexibility for states or districts to use the funding that's coming from the feds, particularly for serving students with disabilities, if this is a large concern?
So guidance from the federal government in terms of how to leverage funds for students with disabilities?
Is there flexibility within the funding, or is there, I've had a question about this. Is there a dedicated funding stream in this federal funding that is going to go specifically for students with disabilities, or is there flexibility where they can prioritize the services for students with disabilities?
My sense, and Austin, you could correct me if I'm wrong, my sense is that there isn't any specific call outs in that way, but that there is that flexibility to do that. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. Within the CARES package, there's not a dedicated stream for serving students with disabilities, but any of the money that's allocated to districts or states, actually any money that's allocated to districts can be used for any activity under IDEA. And there's a couple areas where they call out providing compensatory services or additional technology for students with disabilities, along with other students who might face additional learning challenges during this time. So nothing dedicated, but yes, there is specific flexibility within those funds that can serve students with disabilities.
We do have a question that just came in. How can Title I stabilization grants be adopted to IDEA, or adapted to IDEA services?
I mean, I think it's thinking about it very much in terms of how the specific accommodations that young people with disabilities need and the processes. I see that there's flexibility there to figure out how to support those learners. And then I would say, I think about this very much in the context of, like, for those of you who are educators, thinking about it as a multi-tiered system of support. Multi-tiered systems of support are classroom-based strategies where all students get some sort of universal treatment, whether you have a disability or not, get universal instruction. And then if your students don't respond to that instruction, you get like tier 2, some small group instruction. And then if they don't respond to that, you get some sort of tier 3, more intensive instruction. I think that's kind of like the same way I think about the Title I stabilization grants, is that the universal investments in public education will benefit those students as well. But then to enable the schools and districts to leverage those for more intensive needs that students manifest.
And this is really asking you to get out your crystal ball. I know after the economic
Where did I leave it?
downturn, after the economic downturn and the Great Recession, there had been, before that, some good progress being made toward response to intervention, now known as the multi-tiered levels of intervention. And there were actually response to intervention coordinators dedicated in a number of schools. Some states had made great progress and really prioritized this. And a lot of that, unfortunately, went by the wayside when they had to make budget cuts.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you see that those positions or those specialists could potentially be affected during this economic downturn as well.
And are you thinking about it right now, or like looking again into the future? Will that be? I think,
Future.
yeah, I mean, I think that yes. And I would say that one thing that I've heard a lot come out of this crisis is that an appreciation of schools, like how schools have changed themselves to be able to deliver services, food, other sorts of needs for students. And I think that one potential silver lining to look at this is the reemergence of schools as community centers. So the reemergence of like real emphasis of schools as community school, where the individuals can get those kinds of full services, and there's partnerships between the schools and service providers in the communities. For rural areas in particular, schools have always been that. They are that central meeting place in communities, but I see that as a potential like opportunity that we have to, in light of what's happening, centralize a lot more resources and services, and that schools can be a way that we do that. So I'm hoping that beyond those RTI coordinators, that there's community school coordinators that can help connect students to the services that they need, and that be a way that we think about leveraging resources going forward. I don't know, does that answer your question, Michelle? Or?
Yeah, no, that's really insightful, especially where there was already some interest in some states moving more to a whole child or community schools approach anyway, and really thinking about all the different ways the schools could be coordinating these different services that students need. And I think that makes a lot of sense, what you just said, that there will be a need for that even more now, perhaps.
And we can set I think the stage for that by really prioritizing in our states, again, like public education. The public education can come out of all this much stronger than when it even came in, but that's going to be really a matter of the explicit decisions that we make and the priorities that we claim, both in terms of public education and those who it serves that have traditionally faced the greatest disadvantage.
Are there any last questions, or it looks like we probably have time for one more question, or for someone to unmute their line and share what's going on in their state? I'm also going to check to see if anybody has their hands up, just in case. I don't see anyone. All right. Well, I think we ended on a really powerful note with the statement that you just made, Ace. And I think that this gives state legislators and legislative staff a lot to think about. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It really highlights like the values that you all have for joining this webinar and for facilitating it. I really appreciate it.
Sure. And I just want to remind everyone that on Friday, we have another virtual meeting again at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And this one will be focused on state budget updates. We will have somebody from our fiscal affairs program to be giving us a general budget update on what we're seeing and hearing from the states and potential impact on state education budgets. So please join us on Friday. We will look forward to that. And again, thank you, Ace, for joining us.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Have a great day. Thank you so much.